no one loves HR, Colin. You know that, and I know that. I don't know if I can curse on this, but I called Detroit a shithole when I moved here. Empathy, I think it is so hard to get. We say it a lot. It's not enough to have a good idea. It's just the beginning.
Welcome to Startup or Shut Up. I'm Colin, and you're live with Abby Gates, founder of Sproutwise, people culture studio that helps early stage teams hire smarter, onboard faster, and build systems that actually scale. Abby's built talent engines as fast growth tech companies and now brings those playbooks to founders who don't have a full-time HR team yet. Welcome to the show, Abby.
Colin, I'm so excited.
Yes.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
It was super inspirational when I first met you in Kalamazoo for Kalamazoo Pitch Night and everything. And your viewpoint is really strong, and I think there is quite a need with your product. But before we kind of start talking about Sproutwise, let's talk about you, right? What were you like as a kid? Organized ringleader, creative thinker, or what else? How would you describe yourself?
It's funny you asked this question. There's a lovely human being named Emma who's local in the Ann Arbor scene, and she hosts these breathwork classes that I've done. And in fact, I'll get to do another retreat with her in December. And as part of her process, she had me take this, it was a survey to determine what's your persona, what's your ethos, or how would we categorize you? And what I got was shapeshifter. And it was, there's no specific bucket that I could feasibly put myself in, or an identity I felt like I could own. And I feel like this also extends to Abby as a kid. I think there were a lot of identities. I think, the entirety of my childhood was a lot of different things that I was trying on. I was an athlete. I was a good student. I tried to be a good friend. I tried to navigate this anxiety that I knew later would crop up, and, things. I'm a member of a gigantic family, tight-knit family. I'm a Midwesterner. And then, I think there's also this element of, when I'm asked what my hometown was, I don't even know if that I have a specific answer for that. I'm a Chicagoan who grew up in Southwest Michigan, who ended up in high school in Indiana, college in the middle of Michigan, the middle of nowhere, Michigan. And then I've since spent my professional career in Detroit. There's a lot of identities that I think I have. It's one of my very favorite things about myself. But yeah, I don't know that there's a specific bucket I would have thrown myself in as a kid.
Yeah, definitely. And you brought up a little bit about anxiety, and I want to touch on that a little bit more. As founders, as business owners, of course, we kind of feel like sometimes we're not in the right place at the right time. That's anxiety inducing. How did you manage that growing up, and then also how over time as an adult now?
I mean, I didn't as a kid. I think if I'm going to put my therapist hat on, and the many that I've seen, and a massive thank you to those who do that work, I cannot begin to say how important that self-work has been in my professional life and also personally. But I think that anxiety I found coping mechanisms to guide around it. It became being a high achiever. It became holding myself to arguably impossibly high standards. It became worrying about anything and everything that I could define as a success in my life, as an athlete, as a student, as a friend, as someone who in high school, it's social capital, any of these things that I felt like I could hold myself to a standard. I think that there was always a measuring stick attached to what I did. And inevitably you fall short. You fall short in any of those things throughout your life. And I think that was where I struggled. And I think especially when I graduated from college, and then this is where rubber meets the road. Then it becomes, my gosh, it's capability, it's self-worth. And I think so many of us derive so much of our self-worth with what we achieve and what we do professionally. And, certainly as the stakes got higher, as I became a fully fledged adult, and I have a family now and a husband, and so many things that are very important to me, I think the scales tipped to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. It became all-consuming. So when I was a kid, easier, because I think the types of kid things you're dealing with and thinking about are lower stakes things in hindsight. They just didn't feel like everything held as much weight as it did when I got to be a little bit older.
Definitely. Very cool. Thank you for sharing that. It's really personal. Who shaped your view of work and community most growing up, and what belief really stuck with you?
I'll attribute this a lot to my dad, and I don't know that it comes down to things like work ethic or watching him or modeling how I might work around what he'd done. I think what I most loved about my dad is that he was someone who was a constant in my life. So I do think when he thought about work, it maybe lifestyle career before there was such a thing, probably to his detriment because his family was so very important to him and being there as a constant in our lives was important. So I think that's something that I've always strived to do is, have that level of presence, which is so hard to do now with the level of distractions and things vying for our attention. But I think that was something I really loved about him and the way that he worked. But I think the other thing too is being a person of service. I can't tell you how many times that I saw my dad go out of his way to help others rise in their own right. And this could have been, I remember my sister and my brother-in-law, they met at a community college in Southwest Michigan. And my brother-in-law at the time didn't have anyone necessarily guiding him toward, for instance, pursuing higher education. He became this really tireless advocate to get him to that stage in his life where he went to school, he helped him to define what the roadmap looked like and was a great champion and advocate for him. And that extended into the work he did in his professional life of helping those find internships, or actually worked at the Mercantile Exchange in Chicago, which is probably a stone's throw from where you are right now, Colin. And so the Board of Trade, the Mercantile Exchange, so helping to get people opportunities in those two entities was a source of great joy for him. He took great pride in it. So I think for me, it's less about maybe professional achievements, even though I've explained it's something that's important to me,
Hmm.
and more about how can success be a shared venture. And I think that was something I really got from my dad.
Definitely. That's extremely powerful. And just by knowing you in a short time, I think you do embody that and portray that quite well. So you've
Thank you.
definitely been able to carry that on. So that's really awesome. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I hope to make him proud. I do have to give a nod to my mom really quickly too,
Yes.
because just and I've since lost both of my parents, so
I'm
this could
sorry.
be just a little reflective. Yeah, thanks. As I'd mentioned, last of a lot of kids, and so my parents had my twin sister and I later in life, but my mom was this just tireless, tenacious, stubborn individual. There was a level of ambition that I think she was just in the wrong generation. I think if she were deployed properly, I say this about my youngest daughter, she's either going to move mountains or climb them, and there's just no in between. And I
Hmm.
think I can attribute a lot of that side of the ambitious side of my professional life and the standards I hold myself to my mom. She was a tour de force in so many ways in her life.
That's so cool. And I would kind of argue with maybe it was the right time for your guys' family because now she's been able to pass that on to your youngest daughter, right? That
Yeah.
tenacity. So
Yeah.
she served
Couldn't
a
agree
great
more.
purpose. Out of curiosity, what was your first job, paid or unpaid? And what did it teach you about people and incentives?
I was just having this conversation with someone the other day, and I was joking and saying that no one was asking me to babysit. Like I never got those opportunities, which cracked me up, knowing how much of a joy it is to be a mother and the nurturing side of myself that came so much later. It was not babysitting, which I think is probably what most younger girls would say is their first job. My very first job was working at so my family had just moved to Northwest Indiana. My dad was in relatively not poor health, but he was someone who was ill. And so we moved to Northwest Indiana with the intention of him being closer to the city where he worked. He commuted into Chicago every day on the South Shore train. And we met our softball coach. I played softball for a long time, and she'd extended an opportunity for my twin sister and I to work in the park department coaching young girls on how to play softball. So my very first job, I think, was making all of $5.15 an hour. It was for a couple of hours a week, and it was working with, like younger versions of Abby in a sport that I loved. It was an identity that I had great pride in at that stage in my life. And it also put me closer to this person, Coach Lev is her name, who has just become this pillar in my life of leadership, of, again, constant advocacy, of giving tough advice and modeling that feedback is a gift and it can be done out of love and respect for you. But it was watching her get to interface with these younger students. She was a special education teacher, so a saint on earth. The work she was doing is so important. I do believe she's still teaching today. Probably the most powerful example of coaching and advocacy in my young life. So it was really cool to get that, even for a short period of time as like a 14-year-old kid, to get to view her doing that and also make, a few, we call them jingly monies in my house, a few cents to rub together so that I could earn something from them.
Very cool. And then how did you motivate your girls when you're coaching and teaching as well? Like what incentives did you provide them in order to actually listen to you?
It's hard. The best players aren't the best coaches. And I'm certainly not saying I'm the best player, but it is such an celebrated skill, this idea of leadership. And until the last handful of years, I don't think I would have been comfortable calling myself a leader. I was not someone that people gravitated toward. I was not a team captain sort of person. I was not someone who naturally slotted into that level of leadership. And so for me, I think I did lean back into a lot of my dad's approach when working with us, which is to get down on their level and to be someone who isn't above the mindset of a kid, for instance, and making it silly and fun and getting people to want to come along with you on the journey by identifying with them. I think is really, if I had to think back at that early skill, it's that. But it certainly was not a well-planned agenda coach. I was not someone who modeled excellence in execution and the operations and the strategy of coaching. I think it was really, you want people to want to work with you. You want people to want to go along the journey with you. And I think for me at that time, it was, you got to get them to like you and let them know that you see them in that process.
Definitely. Yeah, 100%. And that trust as well, right?
Mhm.
Hey, quick pause before we go on. If you're vibing with this conversation, hit the subscribe button right now. Seriously, it takes 1 second and it helps us keep bringing you bigger guests, better sound, and way more inspiration. All right, back to the show. So, you're very much into systems, and out of curiosity, so at what point throughout your career did you start enjoying building processes that started feeling fun for you?
Is more recent than you'd think.
Interesting.
So much of the work we do at Sproutwise, and without getting too far into it, I'll tie this back to me. I think it's you invest yourself in the things that you know you need to work on, that you know don't naturally come to you. And so I think I don't know that I've loved system building as much until I actually founded my company, which is when I understood this is the power it can bring to the chaos of working with a growing organization. And I say this because so much of the work we do in HR is amplifying someone else's vision. I talk about this a lot, which is you work with a team to understand what their fabric is, what their makeup is, and then how do we amplify those things in ways that feel natural to keep going to reinforce. But I don't know that I totally understood the need and quite frankly just how crucial a solid foundation is in that process. And so the work we do tends to be in a lot of foundation building. Lo and behold, I low key love it. I love building systems. I actually love writing policies and thinking through what needs to be in a handbook and how you set the right structure around how a team operates. And I say this, I love dogs. I'd mentioned to you before we started this, Colin, I have a excitable Vizsla named Murphy behind me. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll certainly see he makes an appearance from time to time. But when you're training a dog and we have an electric fence in our yard, they often explain they have to understand where it is that they live, what is okay for me to do, and what are the boundaries that become the things that are not acceptable for me. And so I think about it in the same way. You want to understand, like you want to create a mutually beneficial environment. Your dog stays in your yard, doesn't bother your neighbors, and then is able to run freely and do the things it enjoys within some structure. And I think the same things apply to teams and systems. When you understand what's expected of you, the support and the tools and resources that are available to you to do that job, now you can really unleash yourself. You can operate with a degree of freedom because you're not spending your time sort of wondering at a basic level, what am I doing? Why am I here? And how do I do any sense of good job at it? And I think it's sort of healing what I felt earlier in my career, which is I did struggle with those things. I did struggle with systems that were easy for me to adhere to. And I did struggle with the organization necessary to do those things well on a day-to-day basis. And so I'd actually say the last 3 years is when I can confidently say I'm comfortable and love system building.
Cool, cool. Yeah, and when you were talking about that, it just took me back to like my first job in Chicago where it was just complete chaos. It was just trying to put out fires and there was no direction anywhere. So it was just like,
Mhm.
where am I going? It's so uncomfortable.
Yeah,
No, not in a building way, right? Like as a founder.
right. Yeah. And it's a heavy burden to carry because riding on that for you is your livelihood. It is your opportunity to grow in your career, to realize the goals that you'd set forth for yourself. So not having those things can be detrimental. It can be existential, I would argue. It certainly was for me at different points in my career. So can absolutely empathize with you when you say that chaos can manifest in a way that's not fun. It's not growth oriented. And in fact, detrimental to you at all.
Totally, totally. And let's slide over to risk tolerance then, like the early Abby or your other part of your career versus now. And how did that evolve? Because you've kind of mentioned over the last 3 years, you've kind of grown into this founder of your business. And my assumption would be it's kind of changed a little bit, right?
It has. I think I've always been comfortable with the idea of risk. I think spontaneity in my personal life, professionally, has been a common thread. I can trace back to being even a young athlete. Those chances and I certainly don't take those chances with my body any longer. Like, she's a temple. We take care of her because I'm now in my 40s, so I have to redeploy that level of risk to other things. But all kidding aside, as an athlete, it was taking those chances because there was an outcome on the line, because I was a part of a team and they were depending on me to do those things. And so it always has been something I've been very comfortable with. And I think the difference has become I'm still very comfortable with those things, but I can understand there's a recklessness to the approach that I'd had earlier in my career and as a kid, where you don't factor the consequences of the risk aren't as big. They don't feel as exciting as the potential outcome, the high risk, high reward proposition, which is the high is so high and you feel so good. Though on the flip side of that, the lows can be so low if deployed recklessly. And so I think that's the difference for me, is understanding the structure I need in my life in order to deploy that risk. Am I good at it yet? I think I'm better. I think that'll be something I always have to manage a bit, or find ways to cope around. But I'm certainly more respectful of harnessing that power instead of unleashing it willy-nilly. I think that was probably the kiss of death for young Abby in my career. It's at different points.
Totally. Yeah, I identify with that with you quite a bit because I feel like I'm kind of doing anything and everything. And one of my previous guests actually came out with a 90-day planner, and this is awesome. It's called Go Crazy, and it's really really awesome to be able to plan out and what you want to do in your life, and especially break it down to 90 days. So
What kinds of things go in the 90-day planner? Is this a 90-day personal journey, or are you using it for any and all things as you
every
consider what happens?
Yeah, everything. So he's designed it in such a way where like things that you've really enjoyed accomplishing in your entire life, things you wish you'd done, and then things that have held you back. So there's a lot of taking a moment to reflect, and then also building out your dreams, and then talking about your goals, and then breaking them down a little bit more. So it's really really cool. Like I bought one for my husband too, and we did a date night in order to do it together. And
I love that.
there's even mapping to be able to like visualize and see where each other are at. So it's just kind of cool.
Has there been any particular clarity that has come from that, especially as you've done that as a pair? Any aha moments that you two have discovered?
Yeah, so my husband has a very very good connection with his family. For me, not so much. It's been very turbulent growing up and what have you, and so we kind of expected that his family connection would be like at 100% versus mine, which was a bit more poor, but
Yep.
growing, right? But it's a focus in order to be able to focus in on, right? So it's been kind of interesting, and then it's also cool because we can kind of chat with each other and keep each other as buddies in order to kind of make sure that we're honest and going towards our goals. So, yeah.
Yeah, the yin and yang. It's
Yes.
important to
Yes.
complement each other.
Absolutely. And we are definitely that. So that's really cool. Anyway, so if teenage Abby shadowed you today, what would surprise her most?
I think she might wonder how boring my life is. I think I thought you have these gigantic dreams. And again, as someone comfortable with risk, it's where in the world will I live, and what amazing cool things do I do in a week? How many places do I go? How many people do I see? And I think it would amaze her just how you do establish routines and you establish things that work for you. And so, but I also would like to think she'd be excited by how content I am, because I think there's been this element of discontent, probably because of the anxiety where you fear, will I ever be okay just being? And so I think you're chasing so many things at that stage of your life. Everything is an opportunity. You graduate from high school, and then the real work starts. You're choosing a career, at some point choosing a partner. Will you have a family? Where will you live? What kind of job will you have? All of those things are still dreams at that point. And so I think there'd be I hope, a sense of pride in saying, I've found something that fulfills me, that excites me, that jazzes me up every morning when I do it. And so I'd like to think that would be on the table as well.
That's cool. That's so cool. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That brings us to your rapid fire. Are you ready? So, just like the first thing that comes to your mind, I'm also going to throw in a few interesting ones too. But coffee or tea?
Coffee all day, every
Awesome.
day.
Me too. Me too. That's my big giant cup here.
All right. Mad respect.
Detroit hustle or Ann Arbor brain?
Got to go hustle. As a founder is the name of the game. It is a do now, think later game in so many ways. I aspire to get to Ann Arbor brain, but I think hustle is where I live today.
Cool. Higher for slope or for intercept?
I'm a history major. I remember reading this question. I'm like, it has been so long since I found myself in a math class. So dumb this one down for a kindergartner.
Yeah. So for the ability of growth or for a break even, essentially.
Growth. We talk about this a lot in the startups where I've worked and how we've thought about hiring. Hiring for potential is absolutely where I live. There's so many things in that environment you can't anticipate. You could have never planned for. It is building things that do not exist today. Oftentimes, you make a suggestion that something should exist, and congratulations, you've gotten yourself a new project, and it's completely out of scope for the role that you hold. And so much of that is the appetite for problem solving, for thinking outside of the box, for letting yourself take that level of risk, even though it could flame out terribly. But potential is absolutely my answer on that.
Cool. First 10 employees, athletes or specialists?
Athletes.
Cool.
I love a utility player, especially in those early stages. You get to the point of specializing, but the early ask is someone who can read the play. They need to be able to, there has to be some sense of agility there.
One HR tool that you would keep if everything else vanished?
A payroll tool. I don't know anyone that enjoys the manual, incredibly tactical nature that is payroll, but it is absolutely crucial. At the bare minimum, you've got to satisfy Uncle Sam and the IRS tax code and pay your people. It's a no-brainer for me.
Definitely. Reread docs or meeting live?
Meeting live. I love an ideation session.
Yes, yes. There's so much that comes out of it. I can't remember which company, but they would always go to the boardroom and say, "Give me all the wrong ideas," kind of thing.
Ooh, I might steal that.
Yeah, yeah. Just throw everything on the whiteboard. It doesn't matter how terrible it is because eventually it might end up coming out to be the
Mhm,
best thing.
mhm.
And I wish I could go back to which one it was. But last one, founder superpower you wish more people trained on.
Empathy.
Mm, hmm.
Empathy. I think it is so hard to get. We say it a lot. It's not enough to have a good idea. It's just the beginning. But you've got to get people, you've got to galvanize people to work with and for you on that journey. And to do that, you really have to have an understanding of the people around you, what motivates them, what guides them, what frustrates them, and be able to read that live and adjust accordingly. It
Hmm.
takes such a degree of empathy to do that well.
Yeah, I want to bounce off of that a little bit more and expand. What do you do in a situation that you notice a technical co-founder or a co-founder or an early employee that you notice like maybe their productivity is dropping, maybe they're disconnecting a little bit more? What would you do in that scenario?
So we're talking a coaching scenario. So if I'm in a conversation and is it a one-on-one? Am I just seeing this situation play out in front of me? Set the stage for me.
Yeah, it's just kind of playing out in front of you. And what would be like your first thing that you would do in interacting with that person?
We talk a lot about listening tours, and that sounds like an endeavor. It sounds like a great big initiative, but at the core of that is spending time talking with people one-on-one and understanding what guide, as I've mentioned, what guides them, what do you feel is going well, and what are some things that feel like points of tension. It's understanding the parts of their role, because I'll make some assumptions here and think maybe there's a project or friction between teams, or someone is taking more ownership than they maybe should, or isn't a great collaborator. Doesn't matter. All of those things are common, and but at the heart of that is asking, where is the value that you bring to the organization, and what are people depending on you to deliver? And I think it's also then going into the conversation of what causes tension for you. What causes tension in terms of you may not have the bandwidth to deliver. You may feel that you've got some imposter syndrome, that you'll be found out for not having a skill level. And it's modeling that sort of vulnerable conversation to say, you cannot be all things to everyone on your team. You can't. And then the second you try to do that is the second you trend right into breakdown, and also model that for your team.
Mm.
your team is really looking to you to model some semblance of balance or anything. They're looking at you to model anything, and that's what they becomes the basis for culture and how they approach their work. And so it's having those conversations. And I think a lot of what we do in the people space is give people a safe space to say, here are the things that I really love doing, and here are the things that I either hate doing, am not good at, or maybe aspire to do, but I just don't have that level of skill yet. And I think having those conversations for someone who's highly technical really is one, getting them to that point of having that conversation, and then also veering right into the system side of it. Okay, how would
Mm,
we fix this? You're an
mhm,
engineer, for instance, a software engineer. If you're staring down a problem and you're trying to design a solution to fix it, what are the things that you would do? We do the same things. And it's understanding who on your team is well placed to own this deliverable. What is the timeline that we need to set forth in order for this thing, a minimum viable product, to be delivered?
mhm,
Is this what your team wants? Is this what your clients want?
mm,
It's a lot of this sort of product thinking that I, again, in my systems era, in my 40s now, I understand it's the same sort of problem solving that we do in thinking about building and shipping a product on the software side. It's just in our world, those things are defined with the people in an organization. But it becomes speaking their language as likely a product or engineering resource and saying, it's okay having these conversations, but let's find a way to either motivate or mobilize your team to solve for these things and also recognize your ability as a founder to enable that, stand in the way of it, or champion it as a leader.
awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that, like that little juicy tidbit. Let's bounce over to Sproutwise,
Mm.
your baby. So why People Culture Studio and why now?
I think for me, it was the culmination of everything I've done in my career. I wish I could say there was a level of strategy on how I slowly found the breadcrumb trail that is the people space. Graduated college with many thousands of dollars of student loan debt, and so I realized I have to get a job. And at that point, I was thinking I was going to go to law school. But the missing piece there was I actually clerked in a law firm when I was in school, and there was this missing piece of getting to work directly with people. And so I think if I'm really thinking through, recruiting was the first job I'd gotten at an agency. Why was there that immediate interest? Why did it feel so natural for me? And everything in my life is really about connecting. And I especially love connecting one-on-one with people because I think there's so much depth to get from those conversations and understanding someone's story, someone's journey. And I do think that everyone brings a gift to the table that we can help them get more of. And so over time in recruiting, it's a promise. Everything in that process is simply a promise. It is a sales process. So doing that for a decade or more, and at some point finding myself working in startups, it's a promise, and it's also a frequent promise, especially at companies who were growing in the early 2000s to 2010s, because VCs were printing money. These companies were growing at a clip that was so hard to manage, and so we were hiring a lot.
Mm,
And so then it becomes you hit these hockey stick moments in startups, and there becomes this inflection point of how do you retain that early culture when you've now added you've diluted it only because you've added so many people with so many different perspectives, and if your foundation wasn't strong to begin with, it becomes really hard to manage that and also define it. And so at some point, moving into a broader HR role was of interest. And it cracked me up for a long time because I could never understand why recruiting and HR just seemed to hate each other so much at startups. Like there was always this, it was like a blood sport. And it was, your only job in recruiting is to hire as many people as you can. And you don't care about delivering for them. It's the same thing as sales and customer success or
hmm.
sales and delivery. It's like you don't
Yep.
even know what you're selling. You're just selling it for an outcome. And so moving into HR took so much longer than I'd planned for. But it was the way that we could think of. We have been so careful to craft our brand as a company and to stand up what we call our employer value proposition. How are you getting people to come and stay here? To give them opportunities for impact, to do this cool role at this company growing very quickly, and to have this very quick trajectory of growth for the ambitious sort of person that tends to join an early stage startup. And so in that capacity, I think it was one, how do we deliver on that? And then two, at some point in time, how do we really become the glue and operationalize that? Like, how do we do that well at scale became this, interesting problem for me to solve. But I think the real inflection point for me was when, I became an executive on those teams, and I've been through 4 exits. So when I talk about quick growth, it's, this couple of year journey where we're going from 100 to, in some cases, like 1,500, 1,000 employees. And so it really is fast. And inevitably in that journey, like a VP or head of people or a chief people officer wouldn't be hired until, let's say, like 50, 75 people. And the early culture that you're trying to replicate, that person had no opportunity to affect that, to rein it in, to enable it, to reinforce it, all of those things. And so when I became that person and was plugged into those organizations in that growth journey, it became really hard to be the person who was building the function when it didn't exist before. So I'm having to lead it, build it, partner across the executive team. And there also is this expectation that you're almost a therapist for the entire organization. Because again, work is personal and people place so much of their self-worth and impact on the jobs that they do. And so I think in the founding of Sproutwise, it became, I couldn't understand why time and time again I was brought to the party so late. It's like, I like parties. I want to be an early invite. I want to be on the A list. But it's sort of hard to define HR in terms of value. We're a cost center. If you're looking at, just straight up the finances of an organization, it's easy to point at a balance sheet and say your top two costs for any organization are your labor costs and then benefits and the things that you're offering to your team. And so for a team that is so cost heavy and defining that value when you're talking about humans, there's 1,000 shades of gray. We live in a very nebulous, nuanced sort of thing. It's hard to define. And I think it's hard to define value on top of that. And so the impetus for Sproutwise was, how do we pull some of that work ahead so that we're working with founders? And we know part of their journey, part of their dream is to build the organization that they themselves would have wanted to work for. And so I know that they come by it honestly and they want to build an organization that people want to work with them, that they feel safe, that they're also doing great work, that they can say when they're retiring in how many years, what is the best job and the best boss you've ever worked for? Anyone would want to say those things, but oftentimes people struggle with the nuance of how do I do this thing well? And so what we're trying to do is work with companies earlier in that journey to say there are approachable, flexible, necessary things that you should be doing early that will pay dividends as you grow, that won't make growth seem so hard when it comes to growing your team and adding more people to the mix and enabling them and empowering them and championing them. And I've certainly seen that go poorly in my career. And I've seen and had bosses where it modeled such excellence. I want everyone to feel what it feels like to have someone that is so emphatically in your corner and is so invested in your success, oftentimes more than I was at that point, that all you want to do is replicate that time and time again. So it's what we try to do is institute some of those early lessons and structure the systems I talked about in a way that feels authentic at that stage of growth, instead of bringing in a VP of people at 10 employees when you're truly bringing a gun to a knife fight. It's not necessary, but there are things that are and that you can do early in the journey that are authentic and needed and don't feel so heavy-handed.
Cool. Thank you for that. And you mentioned 4 exits. I just want to slide back to that. Which companies did you exit from?
The first was Secure24, which was my very first startup. And they exited via, I think it was a PE acquisition by a company called Pamlico. So it was the first time I saw what happens when an organization changes hands. And there's this feeling of such grief where it becomes what we knew and what we built is now different. And there's this heavy emotional toll, at least that I felt. I'm a sensitive little soul at my core, Colin. Not even at my core. It's like on my sleeve. I wear it. I wear it as an outfit every day. So that was the first one, was Secure24. They've since gone on to be acquired by a multinational, like gigantic conglomerate, technology conglomerate called NTT, although I'd exited far sooner than that. The second was HookLogic. And it was such a special organization in that it was probably the first time I'd worked so closely with software engineers and being so close to the beating heart of how products are built. And I think there's such joy in watching someone so invested in their craft and who loves nothing more than to explain to people how to build or how they might approach a building process and get other people to go along that journey with them. So I think it was the tight-knit atmosphere of working alongside product and software engineers. And that organization was acquired by a French ad tech firm called Criteo. And talk about a culture shock, like the way a French organization would now fold in an American-based organization, very different. Again, totally felt like grief. And I remember thinking, like, what now? Where's my role? How do I still have these same relationships. So I very much struggled with these instances. The third exit was Dynatrace, which had gone, and I can't remember the journey here. So if any Detroiters are watching this and want to slap my hand on the facts here, but Dynatrace at some point, I think it was a freestanding organization, and I think at some point it hitched its wagon to CompuWare, which was a legacy technology organization in Detroit. Just a massive, massive organization by our standards. And at some point split. And then Dynatrace, it was the first and only IPO I've been a part of. And it was just such excitement and an outcome. And I remember there being glasses of champagne. Again, I think there is this realization that this will have very large changes to our organization. There's now shareholders to manage and public information that needs to be disclosed. And there's a sense of being buttoned up that I think I didn't love as someone who was, again, building when they didn't exist. Like, you're getting a minimum viable product out the door. Your goal is to get something that works very quickly. So squaring that with an IPO where it's like, okay, we've got to sit up a little straighter and approach this in a very systematic, large way. I think I realized at that point, publicly traded companies, not my thing. It's not really where I want to play. And the last exit was probably the most heartbreaking of all of them. And it was because, as I'd mentioned, I've had the chance to work for leaders and with companies where there is such excitement and desire on the team to be of service to those around you. There was such a genuine love of everyone on that organization and a sense of trust. There was such a safety net in a time where it's so hard to define a safety net in startup land. Everything feels like it is, you're one card away from toppling the whole structure. And so to have that sense of with the team was in and of itself amazing. I'd had that before. The difference here was that I worked for a CEO who I often joke that I would walk over burning hot coals for, because it was just, he saw something in me I probably didn't see. He hired me for a job that I didn't think I was qualified to do. And then he let me loose. He was like, I remember in the interview process, it was, he'd said to me, we'd had a conversation about what was going on in the organization. The company was solving. And he'd shared, I don't do this. This is not work I do. So at the end of the conversation, he had basically said to me, I want you to tell me what you think we need. And I remember thinking, like, what? You're asking me? We've talked for an hour. I've got an outside in looking view of this. How am I even in a position to give you anything that is worth reading? But it was such a powerful opportunity at early trust building. It was iterative co-creation of something. It was, how does this land? There was so much wonder and awe in that process of, this person is trusting me to basically call my shot. And that carried through. There were times when I remember I'd said to him, it feels like you don't talk to me often, like you might cancel our one-on-ones, and it hurt my feelings. I remember at the time feeling very sensitive about this, like he doesn't want to talk to me. And at some point I had this aha moment, and I'd said to him, oh, you're not talking to me because you don't feel like you have to, because there is that trust there. And he's like, aha, you finally arrived. Like, I'm glad you finally gotten here. That's exactly right. And so it was it was a showing by modeling and doing rather than telling. This was someone who let people grow into their own with a constant sense of support and advocacy, which is such an important thing. So when we were acquired by Zoom, I remember bursting out into tears. I was so heartbroken because all I wanted was to continue to work for this person and explore this more. I'd still be there. If that company were still around, I guarantee I'd still be at that organization. I loved it so much. So those are the 4 exits I've been a part of, and all unique, all grief-inducing, happy to be a part of all of those success stories. But I miss those teams. I do miss the people we got a chance to grow with. There's tremendous vulnerability involved in putting yourself on the line like that. And I miss them all dearly.
How powerful. That's extremely powerful for you to feel empowered. And my argument for that too, for Abby, these experiences all brought you here, like brought you to this moment where you could just build Sproutwise. Because my argument is kind of like all great things have to come to an end eventually.
Yeah.
Still
And
great.
you're right. I wouldn't change it. I really wouldn't. I think you can't have grief without love. And I think and that applies to every area of our lives. My husband and I, as I've mentioned, are huge dog fans. We've had 3 dogs together. We've since lost 2, and it's so hard for him to invest himself in another dog because we have to say goodbye at some point.
Hmm.
And so, but he recognizes that we're so fortunate to have those years with family members. Like they really become a part of our family. And the same applies here. I wouldn't trade it. I wouldn't. I wish they lived longer. I wish those organizations would have continued to grow, but it would have changed anyhow. Something would have changed about that. And I can look back at it fondly, and I'm very grateful and feel a lot of just love for that experience in my life. But you're right, it had to change. You can try to replicate it and learn those lessons and carry those forth. And I wouldn't trade the last 2.5 years for anything. I've never had more fun professionally.
That's so cool. Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Abby. Really appreciate
Mhm,
it.
mhm.
So, if I was a 5-year-old, how would you explain to me what Sproutwise does?
It's interesting you ask this because my 7 and 8-year-old often try to ask me what we do. They get more excited about we've got like decals, like stickers with our logo on it, and I've got a backpack with our logo on it and just other things. So for them, it is the flashiness of the thing they can see and touch.
Mm,
And I think if I were going to explain it to them, they both play soccer, and I think they've both been on teams and have had a chance to get to the point of starting to work together with a team and see some success. And they've certainly been on teams when they'd started and they were awful. I'm not even going to play. Like these teams were just getting just destroyed, like 10, 12, 15 goal losses.
oh
It,
my
it was
goodness.
disheartening for them. And I think what I'd try to explain to them, the power of having a coach that understands where you are and how you can get better and helping you to do that, and just how important it is to have teammates around you who help to make you better and also give you someone to work with in a situation that feels kind of hard. And you frame it around what's the point of soccer? In a soccer game, what are you trying to do? And understanding like what are your OKRs as a team, and understanding, well, how do you get there? Like walk me through how it happens when you're getting a ball down the field. If you do it by yourself, are you successful? I mean, I'd certainly argue my 9-year-old, almost 9-year-old, it's become harder and harder for her to take a breakaway and score a goal on her own. And so I think what she's realizing is the importance of when we talk about passing and involving your teammates and communication, all of these things are crucial for them to realize the goal of the game. And so it'd probably be something like that. If they were to, for them to really get it, I'm sure I'd probably have to talk about Roblox, but I die a little inside thinking about that game, so I'm not going to do that. But um, the iPad is like the bane of my existence in my house, that darn thing. So yeah,
Hmm.
I'd probably talk about it with soccer. They'd want me to talk about it with Roblox.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Thank you. And so, as far as your concept too, like an ideal 90-day engagement with the employees, like cadence, deliverables, outcomes. What do you guys do? What's your best strategy?
I mean, that's even evolved over time, and I
Mm,
think my perspective on this as someone who's now founded a company is very different because I would have absolutely answered that question very differently as a full-time hire when you don't understand all of the plates that are in, like you have spinning in the air. You don't understand the sheer amount of decisions that are dependent on one another. For instance, realizing revenue, or how are we deploying our team? What's our labor burden model, and what's our cost calculator? So the answer there is very different now, 2.5 years in. I'm sure it'll also be more refined as we continue, but this year we've spent a lot of time working on projects, and that slots very nicely into this 90-day engagement model. Though we also work in some advisory, which means call it like phone a friend. It's very much like Diet Coke HR, where we're there to talk you through and coach and advise you on some of these things, though we stop short of executing on them. We won't build
mm,
them for you, but we'll get you to the point where you understand what priorities need your attention now, and what are things we can shelve until you're at a stage where they might make more sense to invest more time and energy in. So there's that piece of it. The project piece is that very tightly defined scenario of there's a starting line, there's a finish line, and there are very clear deliverables that need to be built. And there's still a third bucket where, for all intents and purposes, we are the HR team. We're a retained part of their team just on a part-time basis. And so the success for each of those categories might be different. But I think if we're looking at it as 90 days, there are some constants that still need to happen right off the bat. And it becomes, we cannot make assumptions for what is. The second we do that is the second we lose credibility, trust, and partnership within the business. So it doesn't matter if it's advisory, a project, or something like a retainer model. We have to be the glue within an organization. We have to mobilize these other teams to help go along that journey with us, because no one loves HR, Colin. You know that, and I know that. When we step into a room, there's this deep sigh and a eye roll, because what am I in trouble for now?
Mm-hmm.
So the work we do up front is really to understand what are the opportunities, the gaps, what's working well, how do we continue to do more of those things, because it will adjust or reinforce the roadmap we might have set up when we were in the discovery phase before we'd actually signed a client. So all of that manifests in listening tours and one-on-one conversations, checking in on, is this still the right plan? Who on your team can help to co-lead it? How are we defining success here? What's a meaningful metric or something that's measurable? And who needs to own this when we exit? That's probably the most important part of this, because I think, again, if we're looking at something nuanced and hard to measure, when we talk about exiting, because we are a shelf life company, we know we're not a forever HR solution. Our goal is to get an organization to the point where we can give a full-time HR team a running start, so they have something to work with and something to lean back on. And so there has to be this understanding of who's going to own these things when we're gone. We'll still be here to answer questions from you from time to time, but there still has to be an internal champion holding the team accountable, or having some consistency with these rhythms or processes, understanding why this work is important to do it all. And that's the real goal of this. And those kinds of finite length engagements like a project is, who is going to run with this torch when we've lit it?
Every day, someone is turning their idea into a business. The only question is, will it be you, or will you keep watching from the sidelines? At Peer Founder, you can create a free account and launch a free campaign today. Unlock $500 to kickstart your business. No credit checks, no gatekeepers. Spots are filling fast. Don't wait another day. Head to peerfounder.com and start building your future now.
Cool. Yeah. And I also love all your different products that you have for whatever organization might need. It's very creative and very smart. If you were to describe the best startup or company that is in need of your assistance, how would you describe them? Your ideal customer.
Yeah, I'll invoke some change of perspective over time, because 2.5 years ago, I would have said a VC-backed tech startup.
Okay.
Probably on the coasts. There's the capital to invest in a team. There is a need for growth. There's some degree of chaos, and someone's bearing that burden today. So that would have been our ICP starting out. And I think what we've realized over time is, and the reason I would say that is because that's where I worked. That's where I grew up professionally. And, the kinds of companies we now work with would have never hired me to do this job. They just wouldn't have. If they were going to stare down an offer letter for a 40-hour full-time person like me, they wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have fit their category of a leader based on my background working in these companies and the pace at how I work, or take your pick. It could be any number of things, a lack of domain knowledge in their industry, for instance. And so what we've realized, though, is that over time, it doesn't matter what work is being done, the same sorts of things are true. People are still you're still probably having a tricky time finding talent. Or even if you're flush with candidates, if you're the Googles of the world, you still have to figure out, how are you motivating and exciting that candidate to now do work? We call that reducing time to value. We're still trying to figure out how to determine what constitutes a job well done. What defines excellence in your organization? What are some operating agreements and things that are important to your company, your culture? So it doesn't matter what is being done, meaning like the work, but those things become constants in the work that's being done. And so it's been interesting to branch out into these other organizations. So my answer to the question now is, any organization where someone either doesn't own this, meaning that there's no current HR team in existence, or there is a degree of chaos or growth happening where there needs to be some additional capacity to deliver on these things. And there might just need to be some extra expertise. We tend to slot in companies that are probably around, let's call it 10 to 50 to 75 employees is where I'd say our sweet spot is. That there is a viable organization. There is growth happening, meaning it could be revenue, but in some of these startups, like the revenue stuff is dragging, but they'll invest in building out the team. What we're most interested in, there are people on your team doing work, and someone's got to manage how that work is being done, the people managing how that work is being done, and the standards by which we're measuring those things and the rhythms. So that tends to be where we play. Beyond that, I don't care what industry it's in, as long as it's in the continental United States. And there's a need for this kind of expertise and a recognition that it's important. There has to be some regard to value. If I'm having to convince a founder why building for their team and considering the needs of their team is important, that tends to be a much harder engagement for us, because our starting line is we have to kick it old school and define values. We have to understand, do you know how your team works today or what's important to them? So if we're starting there, it becomes so much harder to then go into scoping out projects or a roadmap and actually delivering on those things.
Very interesting. Yeah. Thank you for that. And if Sproutwise disappeared for a month, what would your clients miss first?
Ooh. Emily Samar on my team would probably say, this is why we should have had case studies, Abby. This is why we should have been building some of our marketing collateral and material. I tend to think the advisory piece that we bring to the table, I think and I don't want to undercut the work we do.
Totally.
It's important. But I do think some of it is validation of the direction they're wanting to head. Am I doing right by my people? And I think that tends to be the glue for us in those conversations, which is a level of empathy and understanding of the challenges, and also what options they might have moving forward. It doesn't tend to be black and white answers that we might say, but it is a risk calculation. Think about engaging with a lawyer, for instance. It's not always black and white in what you should do. It is a matter of your appetite for risk. What is it that you're comfortable shouldering? And that applies to the laws that you're held to as a citizen of any country. And in our world, it becomes, what is it that you're comfortable shouldering in terms of risk for your people? And that might be, there's a sensitive exit, or I'm deciding what key hire to add to my team as an early stage startup. And how do I determine whether this person's a good fit? I think there's a lot of validation in that process. So I do find that tends to be something that is a common thread in all of our engagements and clients. And I think would probably be the thing they'd miss, is that hard to define, nuanced, nebulous stuff that tends to be where our special sauce comes from.
Very cool. Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so now we're going to our not so fun fact. So a quick reality check on access to capital in the United States. Black founded startups are receiving anywhere from 0.3 to 0.5 of VC funds in 2024, multi-year low, according to Crunchbase. Female founders deal share hit a multi-year low as well, with capital to female founded companies and growing in terms of money, but share slipped as well, according to PitchBook. Then, of course, Latino founders persistently are just around 1 to 2% of total VC. And when I first met you, there was a conversation about this as well. The last year, it's even slid from even 2% of diverse groups receiving VC funds to now 1%. So Abby, what's one of the people ops practice that measurably widens the funnel for underrepresented talent at early stage startups?
The people ops practice?
Yes. What's one people ops practice that measurably can widen the funnel for underrepresented talent at early stage startups?
It's an important question. It's a hard question. I don't know that there's a silver bullet here, because I think there's so many things that come into play. I think, and I don't know if this is answering the question, but I'll kind of follow this thread and talk through it.
Definitely.
I think representation matters. I just do. I mean, and so my answer I'll use Attentive. Attentive is an example here. Attentive was a company I joined at about 100 employees and got to be, I think, 1,200, 1,400 by the time that I left. And it was a fully remote team based across the United States, because it was in the lead up. I joined just before the pandemic and worked for another about year and a half, just under 2 years at that organization as they scaled. And the roadmap changed dramatically, as it did with many companies when you're thinking your team is going to be largely based in a certain geography, and it ends up being, we don't care where you live, provided you can do a job and you do it well and you understand the level of chaos involved in doing it here. we're good. And I think at that point, I'd taken that step back in my career, meaning like I'd previously managed recruiting teams because I had had two babies back to back. My girls at that point were, I think, 1 and 2. And I remember thinking when I was interviewing for that job, it was about 5 p.m. on a winter night and it was pitch dark I remember being pitch dark in my office. And my office at the time was about 10 feet from my kitchen. And I remember my husband, as parents of young kids do, getting really frustrated with my kids about not eating the meal he'd prepared for them. Like it was, I could hear the yelling happening behind me. And I remember at that time thinking, I walked out and was like, you blew that for me. I can't believe that I showed my cards. I've got this young family and now they're going to think I'm not a serious person. And I'm going into this taking on a recruiting role, knowing that it's probably not terribly fulfilling work for me, but it's an opportunity to work for companies that I'm used to and a high growth company. And so I remember having such embarrassment, like I'd pulled the rug out from underneath myself. Like people like me don't work for companies like that. They just didn't. And this is coming from a position of great privilege. I am socioeconomically and where I live and my race, my upbringing, this is coming from someone with great privilege. And so where I'm going with this is as that company grew, one of the things that we did start to create were employee resource groups. And I think the important part there is that it surfaced some things that the rest of the organization may not have ever known. They just wouldn't have known why these things were important. So I remember having, I think we had an LGBTQ group. I headed up the Parents at Attentive group. We had a BIPOC group and so on and so forth. Like there was a lot of representation. And I remember for our purposes, we were shocked that our parental leave was so disparate between categories of parents, meaning delivering parents would get a far larger amount of leave, non-delivering parents in whatever way that manifested. And for same-sex couples or adoptive couples, how are you determining who is the delivering parent, for instance? And so that sort of disparity there was pretty alarming for a very progressive company. And this was during the time and our recent political history where we were very socially progressive as a country. So understanding what other comparable organizations were doing and what we were doing, and then surfacing those challenges to our leadership team with the backing of that employee resource group. And we had a charter. It was a fully formed entity within the organization. And so when we talk about representation and how much it matters, those things make being a parent, in my case, feel much more okay than what I felt even a year and a half prior when I was interviewing for that organization. And the same can be said for people of color or those who are in same-sex relationships or those who, for any number of identities that we hold. I remember feeling immense pride at our level of representation. So I think those things, when you get to a size of an organization and can fully realize those as groups, incredible. But I think giving a place and a space to surface feedback from your team that may impact the many identities that people hold is so crucial. And that could be in surveys. It could be, again, in those one-on-one opportunities. It could be in being very intentional and understanding the life that someone has, the identity they hold when they're not doing work for your organization and how that impacts or informs the work they do with you at all. So it's some version of those things. I use the ERG groups because it's more substantive and there was an outcome there. I forgot to say we did end up arguing for equal parental leave for all categories of parents. And that was adopted by our legal team and the company as a whole. And we did roll out some additional opportunities for parents to see some support that we don't have as a country. And so I think that sort of representation in those rhythms, or at least understanding why it's important, different points of view, different perspectives. And this could be where you live, at what stage of your career you are, where you went to college, how you identify as a human being, any of those things, and understanding that is crucial to include in any rhythm in your organization, any people ops practice.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you for all of that. And that brings me to a question as far as DEI. Because DEI is a dirty acronym now as of this year. And how are your clients navigating these challenges of the dirty DEI word, and how you advise them to build out their teams and advice that you're giving them?
This was something we talked about freely 5 and 6 years ago. It was and again, the types of organizations I've worked for have historically been very socially progressive. So I think we were the torchbearers of, or the bellwether of what was happening in the industry, and very employee-centric organizations, because there's so much competitiveness. And so I think there's a lot of macro pressure for companies like ours because, again, VC-backed companies, they could attract talent from any number of places around the world. We were attracting talent from high caliber, high pedigree institutions, but also competing against the Facebooks and the Amazons of the world. And so I think that pressure forced the hand of that sort of organization to adapt those things. And I do feel like we've seen a rather large course correction there on how we frame up these initiatives and how visible it might be to think about why different perspectives or identities are important. I think companies don't talk about them as explicitly as they once did with us, to say those things are important. And so I do feel like it is a bit delicate, is the sense I've gotten. And the same goes for us. I don't know what we're wading into when we engage with a customer and where they sit along the political paradigm, or just how employee-centric their practices might be, how progressive they might like to be. And so we often take our cues from those organizations by understanding, asking lots of questions, for instance. What's important to you when you think about where your team is today and where you'd like to see your team grow? Tell me a bit about the facets that are a part of that picture. What's in your mind's eye when you think about where your team is 5 years from now? And we're not talking about revenue goals or whether you've secured any rounds of funding. What is the experience you want your team to have, and how you want them to feel? And so those kinds of things. So it often comes out in the wash that DEI will sort of present itself in that sort of discussion, but we're not as obvious about how we'll frame those things up because we don't know. We'll impart the importance. We'll talk about why those things are important. And I'll give you an example of this too. One of the things that I've been doing a lot lately, and this is actually how you and I met, Colin, is what is now, we've dubbed it like the Silo Busters grassroots thing. And it's how I ended up on that stage in Kalamazoo. And it was born out of frustration, I think in part by what you're discussing here, which is, why does it feel so hard for us to be in the cool kids club of builders in the state of Michigan? And I don't know if I will not attribute it to an identity of mine or anything, but it does not feel great to feel like an outsider. No matter where you are, no matter the job you do, if you feel like you have a good idea and that there's some traction and you want to see more and you want to do more good work, it's frustrating. So as part of that, it has been, I don't know, 80, 100 conversations that I've had one-on-one over the last couple of months, which is exactly what I've said probably 7 times already, which is a listening tour. Help me understand from your perspective what you're seeing, what are you experiencing? And so what we've realized is there are absolutely some common threads that we've heard from founders, funders, ecosystem partners, and people all around the Midwest ecosystem. And it often comes back to talent. Either I need more money, which same, or I want to find access to high quality talent to help build my company, which love that. That's a great sign of health of the ecosystem and also potential for an organization. But when we start talking about how talent is typically found, that's where we start to see this. When we think about DEI and why it is so important to include in your practices, like a standard VC, let's talk about a portfolio. And a company within that portfolio may say, I want to hire a CTO. I've got a software-based organization. We're building this product. I need someone to lead engineering product. Super standard, run-of-the-mill hire to make at some point in time. And what tends to happen is you can't necessarily post that job widely because of the level of role. This is an executive level role. You tend to be a bit more sly on how you find that kind of talent, which is reasonable. Those tend to be closed door searches. And so now those founders have a couple of different options. And I'm talking about the big buckets here. Do these things happen in other ways? Absolutely. But the first option is going to their portfolio's team and saying, who do you know? And so then we start to see that known entities. These are people they've worked with before. They tend to be successful CTOs who have led organizations. And by and large, the category of those successful CTOs tend to be heterosexual white males. So what you're now doing is redeploying talent, good talent. I'm not saying they're not to be considered for these jobs, but you're already excluding the vast swath of candidates who have the potential to do that job well, simply because they're not known entities. And so that tends to be, the first problem with that scenario. The second scenario is that now you are saddling those same founders with an option to retain an executive search firm. Well, to do that, we're talking for an executive, probably somewhere between $40,000, $60,000, $70,000 for one position. So now
Wow.
if you're considering the lack of funding for already underrepresented talent, so those founders who comprise 0.3 or 1% of populations, and so they already are not founding companies and they don't get as much money, that option now becomes out of reach. It's likely out of reach for most people anyhow, most bootstrapping founders. And again, they're looking for known entities. So the pathways into those leadership roles, at least for a startup in that category, tend to be very standard mechanisms. And so one of the things that I'd surfaced in these conversations was exactly this. How are we enticing people to move here, to live and work here in the state of Michigan? What is it that we offer that sort of talent here? Is it opportunity? Is it reducing the barriers of entry, or lowering the barriers of entry, giving a stronger support structure so that those founders feel like they've got a bit more runway, whether it's monetarily or just it takes me less time to figure out the things that feel so hard about running a company. It could be any number of things. But the point being that if you take just the talent piece, and even at an executive level, already we're being exclusionary on the kinds of people that we're hiring. So, that's one of the things that I would love to do is create a more, I don't know if democratic is the way to think about it, or a shared cost model so that founders across the ecosystem are shouldering a much, much smaller burden of the costs to have a bench of talent that is now introduced to the startup realm. And this could be anyone who knows anyone. It could be Colin knows someone in his network who is a scrappy, up and coming, amazing senior technology resource that would have never fallen on the radar of an executive search company, for instance. But if you find you're hiring that same type of person time and time again, people also tend to hire people they know, have worked with, and that maybe look and think like them. So it's things as simple as something like that I found there's a little bit of barrier, and I can't quite figure out why. This is where I talk about not making assumptions. I don't know the root cause behind this, but I know the outcome, which is fairly homogenous types of organizations, at least in startups. And so it's a really big, interesting question. And I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but damn it, I'm trying to figure it out with the help of lots of people as part of these many, many conversations I've had.
Yeah, and it almost seems like if you're recycling older talent that's just used to it just seems like you're kind of getting the same ideas over and over. So then the company is just kind of another white label of whatever the company that they were at potentially. And then the creativity is kind of lost too, because they have a different lived perceived motion, and maybe the product isn't even something that they would even personally use, right? Like, so yeah,
Right.
it's frustrating. So
It is frustrating. And I think it's also worth pointing out here is that when we talk about DEI, it is not an ethnicity question. It is not a how you identify sexually. It is considering any opportunity where there's a disparity between the convention of who is often invited into those rooms and given those opportunities and those who are not. And for different scenarios, that could manifest in very different ways. I would also argue that diversity is also a difference in perspective, which has no bearing in identity. But the point being that DE&I, to me at least, when I think about it, it is inviting lots of different perspectives into the discussion, regardless of how that person may identify, because success is better shared. And I do believe that when the tide rises, all boats rise. There's an opportunity to harness so much talent, especially in Michigan, which is near and dear to my heart right now. But the same held true in any company where I've worked. A wealth of talent to be found. The hardest part is finding them. And if you're already making it harder for those people to feel like they can work and thrive at organizations like yours, wherever they fall on the DEI spectrum. And again, I want to be clear on that. It could be any number of things or identities or categories of person or perspectives. If you're not doing those things, then the lack of wanting to change that or be someone who already feels like an outsider, now having to make more change or invest themselves into paving the road for the people that walk behind them, that's a big ask. It's a big ask and a big responsibility. So it is this, the cycle sort of perpetuates itself because it's hard to do. It's hard to be the first or the first of a few people to do something if your identity, your perspective is not the norm.
Totally. Totally. Well, thank you for so much for that conversation. That's really, really awesome. Okay, hold up. If you've listened this far and you still haven't subscribed, what are you even doing here? I'm out here losing sleep, drinking way too much coffee, and editing like a madman. The least you can do is hit that button. No, seriously. Go ahead. I'll wait. Awesome. Thank you very much. There it is. You're officially part of the Startup and Shut Up fam. Let's go back to it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's slide over to the next section about hiring smart and early. When should a founder not hire next and maybe fix a system instead?
I had a conversation with someone that I worked with a long time ago, and it was on this sort of path. And we arrived at this idea, or this question rather, and it was, is it a process issue? Is it a people issue? Or is it a patience issue? Meaning, like, have you not operationalized something that would take the burden off this feeling of tension you're having? Something's not being done. No one owns it. It's not being done quickly enough, whatever the measuring stick might be. And might it be a need for process refinement rather than adding someone to the mix? And let's say you've satisfied that part of the equation, and now you're into those processes have been defined, or we do have an iterative process to address like the incremental changes that we can make to build those things, but we don't have the capacity. And that's where we start to see it might be a people issue, or we have a lack of domain knowledge in something. We start to see this in startups where a function doesn't exist, like HR. So someone who does not own or have deep expertise in a certain area, and for them to do it would take so much more time and frankly money to do well. And so that starts to beg the question, is it now a people issue? And that's where we start to see this. And then it becomes, have we just not weighted these things out enough? And this might play out with, again, you've defined some baseline processes, you have a department that is built, but maybe you've got a team full of very new hires to the team. And we talk about time to value. For instance, a salesperson, it takes any good enterprise salesperson a solid quarter to get their feet under them. It just takes some time for them to understand who is our ICP, what sort of accounts am I calling on, how am I navigating this quota structure, what resources are available behind me to help support that, and get people through the funnel to get to the point of sale. So we see this in a situation like that where the only cure for this is time. There might be that person that burns the world on fire the second they walk in your organization and are the second coming of Christ to your team because they picked it up so quickly. But that's the exception and not the rule. It often takes people some time to get to gel as a team, to understand their role, and to start doing this and get to the point of, I think it's unconscious competence, where they don't have to think so hard about the job that they're doing. Their energy can now be into refining and doing better relatively easily from a brain power standpoint. It doesn't take them so much effort to do it.
Makes
and
sense.
So that becomes a patience issue. And so when we talk to founders about where they are in that process, and I think I want to actually dig this one back out. I don't know that I've had this conversation as explicitly with someone, but it is around that. Walk me through, what are the kinds of things that you have in place today in order to do this thing you think you need to hire someone for? What things exist? What structure exists? What tools exist? Who owns these things? Are those tools working well today? And is there someone in your team that is charged with making sure that that's the case? So it becomes questions along those paths. And then the questions become the capacity issue. Who's owning this? Is this a scenario where this person owns many, many things and it can only do them at an average level at best because there's just so many things, which is a super common thing in early stage companies? Or is it, again, those things are in place and now it might be some refining of those things? Or now when we talk about the timing or patience element, do we have ways to measure those things at all? And do we need to give it some time to prove out, because we don't know, the systems might exist, but how are you determining whether they need any more work or if that person should be the one to own it? And so it becomes like the patience of both giving someone the time and also giving processes and structure the patience it needs to work well, because it is going to be an iterative process.
Cool. Thank you.
I don't know if I totally answered the question. Does that answer your question?
Yes,
Okay.
definitely. Yeah, 100%. You're diving in and having those conversations to figure out what the actual problem is, right? And then going from there. So let's say you're consulting with a founder, and it's only a founder and a technical co-founder. How do you guys start having the conversation about the first 5 roles in order to build out the team?
Again, we talked about this a little bit earlier around having conversations around what your value is and where you see the organization going. So I think a lot of this comes to what's your vision for the company? And I'll give an example of this. When I founded Sproutwise, one of my old CEOs had said, what do you want out of this? Do you want to be a solopreneur? Do you see this becoming a scalable model where you start to build out your team? And I remember thinking at the time, I don't know, but I had to know. I had to figure that out at some point. So understanding what is it that you're trying to solve for, not from a product standpoint or your solution standpoint, but where is it that you see this going in terms of like your vision for your organization? And again, how it works. Is this something do you desire to do this with other people at all? Are you a better solo operator? And there
Mm,
are people that are excellent at their craft, and we call this specialist tracks when we talk about how to grow in an organization. A classic example of something like that would be an architect on a like an engineering team. This is someone who is so crucial to the organization, but as an IC, that if they stop doing work or aren't someone that the team can depend on, it's likely that there's going to be a massive impact to the success of that organization. But they manage a program or a product or an initiative rather than people. Or there will be people who naturally slot into people management, where they really do thrive in the environment of coaching and helping to get a team full of people to achieve a shared outcome or a shared vision. And so it's understanding if it's a co-founder CEO relationship or CTO CEO relationship, is your growth reliant on adding people to the team now and in the next 6 to 12 months? What sort of things are you able to do? And then it becomes all right, what value do you bring to the organization today? CEO, you're a natural salesperson who's great at connecting people and strategically connecting the dots on opportunities and realizing revenue. Fantastic. Lean into that, and perhaps now it manifests into standing up some structure, or if that is not your bag, maybe it is hiring someone who helps to lead the torch on go to market activities or where your organization comes into contact or intersects with any clients or prospective clients. It's sort of that, like,
mm,
what's your level of expertise in these areas? And are you like, where do you fall in the capacity scheme or whatever? And the same goes with the CTO. Are you in a position now from a budget standpoint to invest in what it needs to do, what you need to do in order to build out your team? What's your area of expertise? Where is your strength? And it might be that that CTO is like, I have no interest whatsoever in managing people. I've heard that more times in my career than I can count. And so then it becomes, okay, if we're looking at your goals as an organization and to do what you've set out to do, it requires many people to make that happen. And if you have no interest in managing those human beings, then what? And it becomes like we sort of get to the point of a need to have versus want to have scenario. And then inevitably, it also comes back down to budget. What is it that you
hmm
can afford to bring on and when? And what sort of runway might your organization have? So it's a lot of those things. And truth be told, this is where in larger organizations, why it is so important for us to have solid partnership across an organization, because you can already see where we have to work with so many different teams to pull this off. We talk about budgeting. No one's putting HR in charge of your general ledger and your financial planning. And why would you? It's not really our thing, but we have to work with our finance team in order to understand what is reasonable and viable from a budget standpoint. The same
hmm
goes for payroll. We, by and large, don't have interest in the taxes that we are required to pay as part of the organization, but it's where you see that intersection with a finance team, legal team, like all of the documents you have when you join an organization, an offer letter, a non-disclosure agreement, or documents you may have when you exit a company, a severance agreement, whatever. Those are all done in partnership with a legal team. So that sort of partnership across the team is crucial. And it's also where we talk about headcount and how those teams work together. What sort of collaboration is necessary to pull this thing off? So that becomes a very large conversation, but those are the many, many questions we tend to ask when scoping out, should we hire for this role? And if the answer is yes, then what? What seniority? What is this person going to be doing? What are the expectations for them? It becomes a great big Q&A game. We ask lots of questions.
Yes, so lots of discovery.
Hmm. Exactly.
One thing that you mentioned sparked my interest because you mentioned like CTOs not wanting to be able to manage anyone or they're just not interested. How have you had those conversations before with them? And let's say maybe they don't have enough budget. Was there a way that you could get around that by training them and they grew into it? Just out of curiosity, because you said that this happens all the time.
Frequently, not all of the time. There are
Yeah.
CTOs I've worked with that are very adept people managers. And I think this one's a hard one. It just is, because I think
Hmm.
we are accustomed to thinking that to move up in an organization requires that you're doing so in a very traditional path. That I get to the point where I now have people working under me and for me, and that is a measure of my success. And so one of the things we've tried to do is model this when we build out career paths. And we've done this with a couple of different companies. There's actually an architecture firm we're working with in Colorado today. And they've run into this same sort of calculation as well, because it is a highly creative environment. For instance, they've got a team full of designers. They've also got a highly technical environment in their architects. And so they often, come at odds with one another because the way that they approach problem solving is so very different. But the same sort of things apply that we would see with software engineers, in that there is a very deep expertise element to the work that they're doing as it relates to like the technicalities of their work. Architects are a good one. So one of the things that we explained was, if we created a visual, and if you are a brand new college graduate, for instance, who's a software engineer and architect, you start as what we call like an IC1. This is an individual contributor one. You are expected to do a lot of learning and invest yourself in growth. That really is the name of the game. It's a lot of shadowing, minimal project ownership, limited influence, limited opportunity for impact. And it's all by design, because your real world knowledge or experience coming in is very limited. But at some point in time, we see this fork in the road for those kinds of situations where we illustrate, like I said, what's called a specialist track. And this is someone who is, again, crucial to the organization as they become more senior in their career. Their opportunity for impact is very, very high. It's just that instead of managing someone, they're managing an initiative. And what we illustrate is that is stacked against the people manager track. And so, whereas the difference there is that you might manage or mobilize a group of people to deliver, but again, neither one of those roles is any more important than the other. So it is making it okay for growth to look and feel a little differently.
Hmm.
And that's been something that's come about in the last few years. As I can't take credit for creating this. We've been very fortunate to have a lot of open source HR information and thought leadership and that sort of thing. But it is illustrating that growth is okay if it doesn't look and feel like a standard, I'm going to be a CTO or bust kind of track. Because there have been many organizations where I've worked where our senior most engineer, again, the product would crumble upon itself if we lost that person. They were incredibly important to the organization, just in a different way. So it becomes that sort of conversation around, again, what's your value to the organization? What are the things that you naturally gravitate toward? And what are the things that people gravitate to you to solve? And it's making it okay to have that conversation to say, might there be something that you quite frankly like more than leading a technical organization as a CTO that still brings as much value to the organization? And then there's some other mechanisms around reinforcing that, around recognition, or how are you encouraging people and motivating them based on that? And that becomes like later stage people ops stuff. But the start is illustrating growth in a way that understands who's doing their growing. The
Cool.
same, I would also argue for salespeople, very similar calculation. I know
Hmm.
plenty of salespeople, and in fact, I'm married to one who has no interest in managing people. It would be the absolute last thing he'd like to do, but he's very comfortable managing a process in large scale enterprise sales deals, which are complex and require a whole lot of seniority and require a lot of moving parts and an understanding of how organizations work and how to navigate that. But the act of squaring that with managing people doing that, he dies a little inside thinking about that. And there are plenty of people that do too.
Definitely, definitely. Cool. And you brought up recognition. That brings me to my last question about people ops in a way. How do you build out recognition rituals that build belonging on a scrappy budget for a startup? What do you recommend to do?
This one can be tough only because I think it requires people to think about a problem in a different way. And I don't know that recognition often feels very natural for companies to do.
Mm,
I think there was a scene from Mad Men that I remember seeing, and it was Don Draper talking to Peggy Olson. And she was saying something to the effect of, "You never tell me thank you." And he's like, "That's what the paycheck is for." And so this sort of expectation that I've given you the opportunity and given you the pathway to grow while failing to recognize that what is important to you, Colin, is very different than what's important to me.
Mhm.
And the types of things that motivate people, it could be words of affirmation. It could be that I love to hear from you that you appreciate the work that I'm doing. You could care less about that and want to know, I want an increase of my salary every year because that is important for me in my financial health, my financial growth. It is something that is a key tenet to the way I live my life professionally. Or it's increasing levels of responsibility because you have someone that is highly ambitious. So it is understanding some of those things, which come back to the basics of the things like the listening tours and the surveys we talked about, or just intentional one-on-ones, and being able to have this kind of dialogue with people and having the empathy to understand it does not look and feel the same for everyone on your team. It can't. It'd be impossible to do.
Mhm.
And so part of it is understanding the key drivers for how people derive that sort of satisfaction externally, largely, and the sort of internal motivators that they hold themselves to, the kind of standards they hold themselves to. So this is a lot of communication. It is a lot of upfront work and understanding those things. And then the structure behind that becomes a measure of that. You start to institute maybe it's a Slack channel. If you have no budget whatsoever, and you've got people on your team that really love being recognized publicly for the work they're doing as unsung heroes. It could be in your team meeting. We had a company I worked for had a prize wheel with low dollar prizes, and it became this thing every all hands meeting where you were entered into this drawing if you were nominated by someone else. So now you can hit the external or extrinsic motivators of getting something tangible from the work you're doing and also being recognized publicly.
Hmm.
It could be an offsite and getting people together because that sort of connection and collaboration is important. And so it's understanding what's the playing field like. If you've got a whole lot of introverts on your team who want nothing to do with an offsite where they're throwing axes at a board, then a team offsite might be the absolute worst thing for someone like that. But they really might love something like a hackathon where they get to put their thinking hats on, deploy their expertise in a way where they get to solve a problem of their own choosing and also work with other people to see that happen. So it's understanding the playing field and then also understanding how to multiply that, how to amplify um, that level of impact that person is looking for at all.
Cool. And I want to pull a little bit more on that too. So, being a remote first company, there's some challenges there of bringing people together in collaboration. What conversations do you have with remote only or remote first companies in order to bring people together in these different kind of atmospheres for the collaboration and teamwork?
I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to, is this a point of friction? Is the remote in again, I've seen this through periods where out of sheer necessity, companies had to be remote. So it was like, it's not on the table whether we can demand our team comes back to the office or not.
Mhm.
We've got to figure out how to make this work well. And so, and also now we've seen the seesaw tip to the other side, which is we're seeing more return to office directives for teams. And so it is a little bit different now than it has been in some of my HR leadership career. But I think it's understanding, is this a problem that needs to be solved at all? Is the team otherwise functioning quite well? And again, are we at the point of iterating on something that's working and seeing that through? It becomes the patience element I was talking about before.
Mhm.
And understanding what people want out of that. If they do need that sort of in-person collaboration, or maybe it's spending some time on a Friday on a team call, softballing some silly little trivia questions to each other just to get to know each other better. So you know what it is that Colin likes what's his sense of humor and how does he like to engage, and how do you create some shared inside jokes or shared memories with your team so that they feel like they're a part of something rather than sitting on their own island. So there's a lot of things you can do, but I think it does start with, is it a problem that needs to be solved at all?
Cool. Cool. Thank you for that. Okay, now we get to jump over to the really fun part, Michigan founder lens. So you are a huge advocate about Michigan founders. You're trying to figure out all these ways to break down barriers for access to capital, for collaboration. You mentioned even like a founders fund where they can have shared expenses in order to have more programs. A bit more, I want to know a little bit more about exactly the initiatives that you're doing right now that are quite interesting. And we'll start there.
Yeah, and I guess to start, I certainly don't want to position myself as an expert. I'm very much on this learning journey of what is in front of us and what has gotten us to today. So I think a lot of it is just, again, stopping short of making assumptions
Yes,
and doing the work to understand what is the perception is sort of where I'm at. I just want to sort of level
absolutely.
set on that to say that's where I'm at in my own journey. So I'm by no means an expert. But I think the question was, is it what are we doing? What kinds of things am I doing in particular? Again, I have had a whole lot of conversations one-on-one, and I think that came from I think I did spend maybe too much time working remotely, Colin.
Mm,
I think at some point in time it was, I done a good enough job at intentionally connecting with people? I say I like doing it. I say I'm good at doing it, but am I actually doing those things? And so it was actually my husband who'd suggested, why don't you reach out to the people you connect with to say, why don't we have a one-on-one conversation so that I can understand what is it that you're after? How can I amplify what that might be in rooms you can't be in? And vice versa, just so we can understand, at least we're not sitting behind computer screens and making assumptions for one another. Why don't we talk about it and see if we might partner on something, or maybe it's making connections for that person, or maybe it's hiring that person. It could go lots of different ways. And again, this conversation came out of one of those conversations, one of those one-on-ones.
yes.
The other thing too is, I don't know that we have a shared understanding that's widely available in the form of data. And so I think we're all sort of left scratching our heads and connecting dots that we've not done a great job substantiating. Or is that actually what's happening, or do we have something to back it up? And so one of the other things that we're doing, so as part of those one-on-one conversations, it became, why don't we start a small group of people to talk about some of this stuff? And then someone had made the suggestion to invite a friend. So everyone on this call now invites a friend. And so the first call was me and two founders of a company called Arity, Jake and Tendo. Hi, guys, if you're watching. And so then I think it was Tendo had said, why don't we have everyone invite a friend? So I think I'd invited Emily. And we started there. It was still very small. Whereas the next call was 10. And now I think the invite list for our upcoming, what we've called Silo Busters meetups, is now 42. So we've seen this domino effect of people getting involved in the conversation. And now we're trying to firm up, well, where do we go with this? What's the shared data set? So we've now got a room full of people talking about those things, which through the power of AI, we can export those things and understand some of the themes that we're hearing. And now we're also going to take our next call to give feedback on a survey, an ecosystem-wide survey based on personas of people, to understand from a service provider lens. I hate that term, by the way, but as someone who's supporting founders operationally, what are the things that go well and some opportunities and some things that I frankly hate? Like, understand what's at play for someone like me, because it'll be very different than it would be for someone like you, Colin, where
Hmm.
you might be thinking about raising capital, or you might have already tried to do that and have run into lots of different barriers to realize that. Whereas we're never going to be in the fundraising conversation, at least not a standard fundraising conversation. So that's not even on our radar.
Hmm.
Whereas for angel investors or VC funds, their perspective obviously will be very different in that their funding philosophy might be something to consider. The funding landscape, do we find that VCs are often investing fairly conservatively for a number of reasons? Are there macro factors involved in this? For instance, a new presidential administration that has had some fairly large changes to how federal budgets are allocated and state level
Hmm.
budgets. All of those things will impact the persona answering these questions. So the next meeting will be to look at that. Are these questions giving us data that will be powerful to the people on this call, and making that an open source opportunity for any founder or someone in the ecosystem to see founders who look and think and act like me and are at the stage of growth are also struggling with these things. So it's not just a me issue. Now we can
Hmm.
come back to this. Is this a systems issue or a process issue? Is the process itself broken, or is this a people issue? I seem to be the only one surfacing this theme. So might it be something I need a different skill set within my organization to achieve? Or are we talking about we need to approach it in a different way, kind of thing? And so that sort of survey we're hoping to launch before the summit, which will take place in Grand Rapids. Go Midwest House, by the way, and will serve as essentially Michigan Tech Week 2025. And so want to get that ready for that stage so we can start to get this data set rolling. I am certainly not saying we are the authority on data in the state of Michigan, but I do think there is this big opportunity to make it more easily accessible. And I will call out that we've had some conversations with the MEDC, for instance, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, and they have done some of this work. And some of this survey data does exist, though to access it requires that you're working closely in conjunction with the MEDC in order to see it, do anything with it, report on it, do any of those things. So our intention is that we want this to be one less barrier for a founder to have in building their organizations, because any one of these things could preclude someone from wanting to do it at all, or losing the patience or the steam or the fire in their belly to do it. Or frankly, it's a game of survival. So maybe they have a 1-month runway in order to get their first client. And then I need to go find a full-time job. So the survey, it's my hope that this will give us some sort of playbook for where should we start. And then, I don't know, I think my team has been very persistent in saying, or asking rather, should we, Sproutwise, be the one to own this? And I don't think that should be the case. We have a particular interest in this information. It's not totally altruistic. I have a business to run. And do we have the capacity to solve this very, very large question, very large problem, these very large opportunities? Arguably not. And so one of the things that we're trying to do, or at least I would love to see happen, I'm gonna manifest this out loud, Colin, because I do think there's something to be said for this idea. And it's when we've started having these conversations with founders, for instance, founders in particular, because you take founders out of the equation, there's no ecosystem. So like they really should be at the center of this conversation. But what I've realized through all of these conversations is, my goodness, this feels exactly like my work as a head of HR in engaging with employees. And those employees all have joined their organization in hopes of doing something cool in their career, or earning lots of money, or solving cool problems. Doesn't matter what it is, but they've chosen to join this company and they're there. These employees of our ecosystem are our founders. And so they're the employees that we now have to help to grow or to capitalize on those skills. And the ecosystem itself is the company. So then you look at all of those stakeholders involved in this picture, whether it's our finance or CFO deciding whether to invest in those initiatives, or operationally, do we have the right support in order for these initiatives to happen at all? Do we have the right level of funding from a state level, or an appetite to see this level of innovation thrive in our state? So we start to see this manifest in there's a company or the ecosystem, our employees are our founders, and now it's what would we normally do if faced with a company full of employees? And coming back to, again, understanding what are their challenges. There are founders, for instance, that probably would never found a company because where in the hell are they going to get health insurance? And so can we lower that barrier of entry by partnering with a Michigan-based business to give access to some level of healthcare? And again, now we start to see total rewards, or what is our employer value proposition? Are we helping to invest in these founders to bridge them from the time that they found this organization until there is either a minimum viable product or some traction from a revenue standpoint? So maybe that's a signing bonus, or like our compensation philosophy for how we're helping people to grow, or a relocation package for some people. What about recruiting talent, and how are they getting access to those things? And again, we've talked about this earlier in the conversation, but can we create a shared opportunity for those companies or employees or those people managers to have access to high quality talent? And could that be from an executive standpoint? Could it be from a rank and file standpoint? Could it be from ensuring that there is enough places and spaces for people to gather so that those conversations are happening organically? But that becomes the basis of talent acquisition, which is how are we finding people? And then it becomes, how are we helping people to grow? So now it's learning and development and performance management. Do founders understand where they are today and where the expectations might be for them to function well in their role? So we start talking about, this is where like coaching, advisory, like executive offsites, or any of those really intentional sessions to help level up someone's skills come into play. Same sort of thing you'll see at large scale organizations around, we've got high potential employees. How do we help them to realize this so they don't leave our company and go work somewhere else? And so we see this sometimes with founders who are like, well, I can get funding from some place in the middle of nowhere, Alabama at a 12-week accelerator. I can't get that here. So I'm going to leave the state and go build here kind of thing. So again, it becomes the same sort of calculation we make, which is how do we make our company attractive to entice people to build here and then keep them here to realize that. And then you think of, well, what happens when those things become true? Well, in an organization, you see an organization that grows in revenue. You see an organization that hires great people. You see an organization with great tenure amongst those people, and you build a team full of evangelists that become grassroots marketing machines. And so the outcome there is a win-win for all involved. And so our state level ecosystem benefits, our founders benefit, the people wanting to do good jobs benefit or move somewhere with a manageable cost of living benefit. Those community spaces and places like Bamboo also benefit because we see this boon of activity and excitement. And so what I'm manifesting is I do believe that there should be this shared people function for the state of Michigan or any ecosystem where we start to build out these pillars similar to what we do, except flipping this on its head and seeing founders as the employees that we need to support, enable, and empower.
Yeah, that's super impactful and really very interesting and very intriguing.
I hope so. Like I said, I'm manifesting it. I think the more I've thought about this idea, the more clarity it's brought. But then it becomes, well, now we're in the same boat as any other person with an idea that needs some traction. Who's going to partner with us to do it? And we have like taken some pains to say, well, what organizations can help us to do some of those things as partners in this process, as part of our pillars? And who's going to pay for it? How are we going to do this? It can't be, much as I would love to say that I'm a self-made billionaire with many commas of dollars to my name, this is an initiative that would need some level of funding to bring to bear. And so that's another consideration here too, is will there be enough value in something like this to bring it to life?
Totally.
And thus kicks us back to some of those first conversations, which is, well, why did I do this to begin with? And it was, I don't know that there's always been this value in working with people and helping to harness their abilities and helping them to grow and stay at companies.
Definitely. Yeah, it almost has to be the entire ecosystem within Michigan that it needs to collaborate together and give like a percentage of whatever, their operating budget or whatever their giving budget is, just to
Right.
see what can happen. Or the state of Michigan just can create another tax. I'm joking. I'm joking.
Every Michigander was like, absolutely not. But
For the roads.
I mean,
For the
yeah,
roads.
but there is that. And I guess what I'll add here is much of this is anecdotal and is ideation central and born out of my excitement because I do this work. But there are measurable impacts of what happens when you have a team that is engaged in the work that they do. Output is higher. The revenue that those companies are able to generate is higher. Tenure of those employees is higher. You'll see people grow within those organizations. Like the outcomes are there and there is substantiation for that beyond, I love people and I want to see them soar. There are ways to do this. Again, it's just, it is it's harder math to math because we're talking about humans and people and it's just really hard to understand. And how do you attribute something to one thing or another when you're talking about that many shades of gray? So, but there are measurable impacts and outputs of investing in that in your team and building an engaged, excited team.
Definitely. And one additional question about this before we move on. How do you think Michigan is structured in such a way to make it uniquely like a hub for entrepreneurs? Because I know Detroit just blew up with startups. And my understanding was because of the bankruptcy, like space was just so available and cheap for them to be able to rent out. But now, like even Detroit's facing an issue where the rent there is just astronomical. It's like Chicago pricing, if not more, right now in downtown Detroit. But yeah, so out of curiosity, why do you think Michigan is so unique to be able to be to create a startup hub essentially?
Again, not an expert. I'm sure
Yes,
there are
yes,
economists who could like connect the dots here from some of those macro to micro elements and say we can actually derive some causation to this. I might be talking totally in correlation land or
Yeah, and
out of my ass. So
I'm
I'll
more
say that.
talking. I'm more talking about your feeling or sensation by
Okay.
being a resident in Michigan, because you've lived in a couple different areas. So just your own sensation. Why do you think Michigan is such a great place for startups?
My perspective.
Yep.
I
Yep.
think people love an underdog story.
Mm,
I talk about my two favorite cities in the US. Detroit is obviously number one, but I love the city of New Orleans. And I think there is such deep pride in that particular city. This is a city that in obviously 2005 absolutely decimated. And like there were so many things laid to bear that showed just how grave their disparity was across their socioeconomic strata, the level of support their residents would receive, the structural infrastructure challenges that they've experienced. Like there's so many things working against them, and yet they still choose that city, and there's still that sense of pride there. And I
hmm
think that's something you do see in Detroit. I remember in Michigan, but I remember Detroit specifically. My dad would tell me my family's from Chicago, and his mom unfortunately had been diagnosed with cancer, and for one reason or another they would go to Toronto for her treatments. And so they would drive from Chicago all the way to Toronto, but intentionally stop in Detroit because it was a jewel of a city. It was an incredible city. And this would have been in the early 1950s. So this is when we were seeing this amazing boom to the US economy after World War II.
hmm
And we saw this era of insane prosperity for the city of Detroit. And I think it was my brother who shared with me that at one point in time, Detroit, Oakland County, rather, one of the counties here was either the most affluent or the second most affluent county in the United States. So there was such wealth here. And then, well, we all saw what happened in the 70s through early 2000s, which is for a number of different reasons, Detroit ended up with the largest municipal bankruptcy filing in US history, which
hmm
was totally embarrassing. It was just, my gosh, like how do you go from one extreme to another in a fairly short period of time in human history? And so to now see that it is possible to grow and innovate, and there is investment and people are starting to get excited, I think people really rally around that turnaround story and being a part of it. I think it feels good to be a part of something like that. And so I think for the purposes of Detroit, we're seeing that. Now, does that same logic hold true in different geographies across the state? Maybe not, but I do think that, again, there's some correlation there. And then I think you look at something like Grand Rapids, where they've carved out a great niche for themselves in biotech and medical technologies and that sort of thing. And I do think this is a city that is on the rise. So again, great pride in where can we take this? And so I think you see both sides of the same coin in that what spurs on the growth. But I do think people are interested in being a part of something. And I think it is cool to see Midwesterners. I don't know what our special flavor is, but I do think we're geared toward community and family and shared success. And I do think that's sort of part of our brand. And so I think you put those couple of factors together and it's galvanized people to say, what can we do if we do it together? And my fear is that, we then get into a very capitalistic mentality, which is a few of us will rise to the top, the cream at the top, and then the rest of everyone else is figuring it out and becomes this sort of meritocracy in that way. But my hope is that we can continue this authentic journey of goodness, like look at us. No one would have ever thought that we'd be in this position. Now let's explore it and see what can happen from here. But I think that's my sort of sense and feeling, and my personal take on it is all of those factors. And this is coming from someone who called Detroit I don't know if I can curse on this, but I called Detroit a shithole when I moved here. It was just, why would you want to move there? Why would you want to start your career there? And now I'm invested in like I grew my family here. I met my husband here. My girls are
hmm
growing up here. They love the state of Michigan. We've got an excellent community. We've got friends that are here. We've got a strong social fabric and also this opportunity for innovation and a place that I can raise a family on comfortably.
hmm
I can afford to live here, I think is another factor I'd be remiss not to add. So
Totally.
yeah, I'm a huge champion of the state.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was one of my things that I was contemplating, because I grew up in Michigan and I was deciding between Detroit or Chicago, and I ultimately went with Chicago. But it's so cool seeing Detroit come back. So we only have a little bit of time. You
Okay.
also gave me goosebumps about the community, but I want to get to your shut up moment. Like, this is where the hardest professional moment you've ever lived through, where people were maybe telling you, Abby, you can't do that. You're never going to be able to do that, or something that came crushing down and you kind of put all the pieces back together. dusted off the dirt on you and went ahead and really thrived?
It was 2010.
Mm,
And I would have been in my mid 20s. And I think it was I hate doing what I'm doing and I don't want to do it anymore. So I quit my job and went backpacking in Southeast Asia for like a month.
love that.
And yeah, and again, I wouldn't change it. The outcome of that meant some really difficult couple of years. And in fact, I still would love to do this. This is still something I'd love to pursue, but I wanted to go into veterinary medicine. So I'd enrolled in college to get some prerequisites out of the way so that I could explore a career in the sciences, which is difficult because every one of those classes has a lab. And so, at the end of and I had ever like, what you, how did you get to this point where you've just upended everything and basically changed everything about your life at this stage? And after I nearly bankrupted myself and, found myself on the receiving end of like heat shutoff notices and trying to figure things out, it was, I ended up going back into recruiting, I think is what it was. But that period of time was where, again, I wouldn't change it. It was an incredible opportunity for me personally what happens if I take the biggest risk I can think of? What's the worst that can happen? And so I think it was that moment of, I've already been through the worst that can happen, nearly. Like, I didn't go bankrupt and I was able to get myself back on my feet. But it was an incredibly vulnerable, uncomfortable, insecure point in my life of just, I don't want to do this anymore. So I'm proud I just went for it and tried to change everything. I think what it taught me was that there has to be a little more thought and care around that sort of change and how do you make it manageable and a reasonable amount
Hmm.
and something that you can see some traction around. And I think Sproutwise wouldn't have happened had I not done that in my early career. I would still love to be a veterinarian, but I do think the things I was looking for in that career are the things that I already had, which is an opportunity to connect, an opportunity to help get people more out of the careers that they've chosen. So that nurturing side of it and being someone who can help to make that happen. There's a diagnosis element around some of these people challenges that can be rather tricky. So there's a problem solving element. So I think it was applying those same types of things that I wanted to flip over my life to achieve. And now I can deploy those in a way that is using a network that I've built and using a career that I've established and by virtue of those relationships that I've had. I don't know that it's a professional moment, but I do remember just walking out of my job. I bought a backpack and took very, very cold showers in Thailand and Bali for a month and a half.
Very cool. I mean, if you didn't do that, you probably wouldn't be here today where you are.
I probably wouldn't be.
Yeah, totally. So I would definitely say that's a professional moment for you in a way. If someone is thinking about starting a business or they're a founder right now struggling, I guess we'll go with two questions at that moment. What would be a piece of advice for either of those people in your own experience? How would you encourage them?
Find someone who's done it before.
Mm,
I can't overstate the importance of how important it was for me to have those early conversations where I remember the nuggets of information my former CEOs or people who had had businesses before had given me. And those things became the baby steps of confidence that I was able to cobble together. But it started with I'm thinking about doing this thing, or what advice might you have? What would you go back and tell yourself when you started this journey? What are some missteps you can easily identify now? But it was establishing an early community of people who I knew I could call on when I was trying to figure out the next step of the game. So follow the breadcrumb trail of mentorship and confidence, because I do think it is such a leap of faith. There's so much risk on the line, but there are so many people who are ready, willing, and excited and helping others along that journey, myself included. So find me. I'd be happy to help talk through that journey or connect that person with someone else that could be helpful for them. But I think that mentorship community element is so, so crucial at that stage.
absolutely. Very cool. Well, Abby, I really appreciate you being so raw and meeting with me today and really painting a lovely picture. And I hope everything goes really well with Sproutwise. I know I'll definitely be using you in the future with Pure Founder. But so let's say someone's interested in you, where can they find you online and connect with you?
LinkedIn Abby Wilhelmy Gates. I think my maiden name still sticks in there, or still is in my tagline. Abby at Sproutwise.com is my email. Also a great way to reach me, but LinkedIn DMs is a great place to start as well. And if there's interest in Sproutwise, hey at Sproutwise.com, and that's Sproutwise, if I'm spelling that right. I should know how to spell my company name, right? But any of those ways, great to reach me. And I'm sure through Colin and your platform here, you could find me as well if we need to put someone in touch. But there's nothing I love more than that. I think that's sort of those conversations, that one-on-one time to connect and understanding where someone is along that journey. There's probably nothing that brings me more professional impact or fulfillment than those conversations. So absolutely invite someone to reach out if that conversation would be powerful.
Absolutely. Well, awesome, Abby. Thank you so much again.